Okay, we've looked at some of the core charts, pricing charts, which might have volume with it, candlesticks, and the depth chart. And now let's start putting this together, particularly how we can start looking at trends and how we can start making decisions on that. And remember, the trend is your friend, right? We want to identify trends, let trends happen, and then ride those trends. So the first thing that you want to do, or that's very common to do, is drawing trend lines and trend channels. And the idea is you're looking to see with these lines and things so you can get a visual representation of where the trend might be so you can help identify trends and might help identify then later as we look at triangles and rectangles and things, patterns of these lines that can indicate things that help us with decision making. So when we're drawing trend lines, we're looking at a basic line pricing chart. We're going to look at it in a second here. And you want to pick a point to start at, and you want to draw these, connecting these lines to draw downtrends and uptrends, right? So a downtrend, you're basically connecting all the highs and seeing if the trend's going down. In an uptrend, you're connecting the lows and seeing if you're trending up by looking at these trends. And don't worry when you're drawing these lines or you're looking at that they're not exact or perfect. It's not a perfect world, so your lines are not going to be necessarily exact. You're looking for an overall trend, not just super perfect lines to be super perfect. You're really looking for the trend. And sometimes you might be in a little bit more of a sideways market anyways. There might not be a very established trend as it is. So, but that'll tell you that by when you draw your trend lines. Okay, so let's draw some trend lines so you can really get an idea of this when we're looking at these charts and see where the trend is and see if we can find some friendly trends. Okay, so here's a standard type of candlestick pricing chart, pricing line chart with candlestick. You got the volume, bars along the bottom there, price on the vertical axis, time along the horizontal, time going left to right, of course. And if we look at this chart now and we start putting trend lines on it, where we can start seeing some patterns. At least early on, initial patterns start to emerge, some basic type patterns. So you can see I've connected the lows here on the left-hand side. You can start seeing where there's a definite kind of upward trend with all those green boxes. The candlestick, once again, is helping to show that as well, versus, let's say, if this was just a simple pricing line chart, the candlesticks actually show me a little bit more too. And then as we get to the peak there, you can see that there's where we're connecting the tops of the candlesticks, and now we're starting to see a downward trend after we get through about a quarter of the way through. You can see in this example, this 30-day period example, each candlestick representing a day, that okay, there's some definite trends going on here, and we can start identifying these trends. Now, when you're doing this, it's pretty simple to draw the lines. It doesn't have to be exact and all that. And this might give you some information, and when we start looking at triangles and other things, we're going to look at this in some other ways too. But when you're drawing this, you want to step back and look at the time periods and say, is this really kind of making sense as far as this overall trends? So for example, as we see like where our volume is spiking to the further right, 3/4 way through where we have those volume spikes, is that part of a downward trend or overall downward trend, or is there really kind of an upward trend that might be starting to emerge? These are the questions that you'll start asking yourself. So if I drew my lines to look more like this, we could see that yes, on the left-hand side, I definitely have my same upward trend, but now on my right-hand side, I have this really steeper downward trend, and then I have this upward trend that might be starting to emerge. Is it emerging or is it not? That is a question. Or is it more part of an overall downward trend like we saw before? So those are some of the questions you'll ask yourself, and maybe layering on some other things to really understand this when we start looking at some other types of ways of interpreting charts. But in the beginning of just getting started, how you draw these trend lines and how you interpret these trend lines will be very, very important. Is it an overall trend down, or are we starting to see a turnaround here as we start looking at that later? Another thing that's important is what's called channels, and they can give you a lot of information too and help with that. So we have these trend line channels, and as you can see here, I basically connect the tops and bottoms over these overall trends. And you can see that there's now forms a channel between the two bars. And on the left-hand side in this example, you can see we have a narrow channel, right? Everything's kind of pretty close as far as the price. It's an upward trend, but it's not a big wide swings in there compared to, let's say, the other two channels that we're looking at in this example, where the top and the bottom of prices are wider between the two, a wider trading range of channels. And you can see on that far right where we were not so sure about, you can see where it connects at the bottom here with those high volume days. Now it's a really wider channel and looks like it might even be spreading out even more. That might lead us to believe that I'm not so sure about that channel because it's so wide that it might continue to be in a downward type trend versus a narrow channel that might tend to stay on that narrower path or narrower road. Let's look at it a different way. Remember, we have that overall pattern again. Now we've got that wide channel, but we've taken out that far right part. And here we would definitely say to ourselves, yes, we're definitely seeing an overall downward trend from that peak. So drawing your trend lines will help you to identify what might be happening. Are we an upward trend or a downward trend? Is not the only thing you want to look at, but it's a starting point and a key starting point when you're analyzing these charts. And because remember, the trend is our friend.